Welcome to Agents of Tech, the podcast where we dive into the minds of the brightest innovators tackling the world's most pressing science and technology challenges. I'm Autria Godfrey.
And I'm Stephen Hall. What an exciting episode we've got today. We're looking at the TechBio revolution where AI and machine learning are combining to aid drug discovery. How exciting is that, Autria?
It's really fascinating because, Stephen, we talk a lot about the biotech industry, but these new up-and-coming companies are really flipping that on its head, and they are in the TechBio revolution. So today we're going to kind of explain what that all means and talk to some of the leaders at the forefront of this.
I'm looking forward to that. But first of all, let me tell you about an interview I did up in New York with Jesse Ehrenfeld, who's the president of the American Medical Association. Now, you'd like Jesse. He's a big, tall, confident fellow, and he had a lot to say about digital health.
We're all digital health people these days, aren't we? We're all wearing our watches, we've all got our devices, but what is digital health?
I mean, digital health is using digital tools to deliver healthcare. And, it started with the electronic health record. Now it's AI tools and digital apps and all sorts of things. And there's a lot of promise, certainly for digital health. And I think we're going to see more and more promising tools coming to the marketplace.
What are some of the biggest innovations? What are some of the biggest changes that we've seen in healthcare, and particularly in psychiatric healthcare?
Well, certainly as digital health changes the landscape, telemedicine has exploded. And because of the pandemic, we probably had 10 years of progress in 6 months through the adoption and use of telehealth in particular. And that has been a game changer for psychiatry. It's improved access, it's improved accessibility. In the US, we've got pandemic flexibility extensions through the end of calendar 2024. And in my role as president of the AMA, we're continuing to push for those flexibilities to be permanently extended so the patients can have access to telepsychiatry and other telehealth platforms, hopefully for the long run.
So what about data? I mean, we must be pretty good now at using data, at storing data. So how does data come into this?
We've gotten better. We're not there yet. Obviously, a lot of the algorithms, the promising AI tools are all fed and rely on data. And having data standards, making sure that data is interoperable, is a core piece of the AMA's digital strategy to make sure that these tools actually work for patients and physicians. But even if you look at an important space like the social determinants of health. We talk about it all the time, but the data standards around how do you know if a patient has housing insecurity? How do you know if a patient has access to refrigeration for medications that they might need at home? Right now, we still don't have clear, consistent documentation fields in our electronic health records. So we're working with the Gravity Project as one way to try to bring those standards forward to improve how we collect data and then ultimately how we can use it.
One of the other issues with data, though, isn't it safeguarding data? Is that a big issue?
There's a lot of concern, particularly with the huge cyber attack on United Healthcare, Change Healthcare, which probably a third of all Americans' healthcare data has been exposed, about how do we truly keep patient privacy and how do we make sure that we protect from cybersecurity. There is no answer to that, and I think we have a lot of anxiety to make sure that we protect particularly sensitive details from a patient's health record.
What about AI? Every conference, every meeting I go to, everybody wants to talk about AI. So how does AI affect digital health?
We are at the peak of the hype curve. We are in an AI era. It is everywhere. I can't go an hour without asking about ChatGPT or large language models. AI is going to be helpful. It is used in 40% of practices in the US today, but it's not the sexy stuff. It's supply chain management, it's billing, it's scheduling, it's those back-end office operations where if there is a mistake, it's not the end of the world. The clinical applications, the therapy chatbots, the prescribing decision support tools, those things are coming. What they will mean for practice, I don't know, but I do know one thing. AI will not replace psychiatrists, but psychiatrists who use AI will replace those who don't.
It's a pretty bold statement, though, to say that AI won't replace psychiatrists, isn't it? How do we know that?
So it's clear to me that when I'm sick, when I'm hurting, I want a person to be able to touch my shoulder, to be on the other end of directing my care. And computers will never replace that. We know that there's something so foundational about the profession and the practice of medicine. It's about the humanity that we bring in the care that we deliver.
Our last question is, I want to encourage you to look into a crystal ball, Jesse, and I want you to tell me, what do you see the biggest innovations happening over maybe the next 5 years?
Scalability. So we have a healthcare workforce crisis. There's a crisis in psychiatry, there's a crisis in behavioral health, there's a crisis in all of healthcare. 83 million Americans do not have access to primary care. 125 million Americans do not have access to behavioral health services. The only way we're going to solve this is not by opening 1,000 new medical schools. That will never happen. It's only by leaning into technology to scale the capacity of our existing care teams by augmenting and boosting our capabilities.
Well, thank you very much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure.
Fascinating stuff. Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, Autria, I'm absolutely delighted to be joined now by Leila Rizvi, who's our head of research here at Web's Edge. Leila, hello.
Hi, thank you for having me.
It's great to have you on our podcast, pal.
Yeah.
It was interesting, wasn't it, Jesse? I mean, he was sort of saying all the hype about AI, right? We're in the sort of hype cycle of AI. We're in the ninth innings when it comes to AI. But right at the moment, it's more of a kind of productivity tool than doctor AI.
I think when looking at AI, it's useful to compare it to previous technology. A good example of this is the iPhone has more power than the computer that sent rockets to the moon. But that doesn't mean everyone with an iPhone is now doing sending satellites up to space, right? So I think AI will be similar to that. Not everyone who has access to AI is going to be curing cancer, but it's going to be doing people's taxes instead, effectively.
But, Jesse was interesting because I bumped into Jesse at the American Psychiatric Association conference. And because a lot of people say, okay, so is AI going to replace the physician, right? And Jesse was very clear to say no, okay. But he had a good line on this. He said that AI is not going to replace the psychiatrist, but the psychiatrist with AI is going to replace the psychiatrist without AI.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think it's those manual cognitive, laborious tasks that AI is going to help us with. AI is creating space for us. It's not taking up that space. So we can just focus on things that we want to focus on. Like a psychiatrist shouldn't have to be spending time filing their taxes, doing administrative, tasks. They should be focusing on the patient and helping their patients get better.
Yeah. What's your take on this, Autria?
Yeah, I think Leila's exactly right. And Stephen, to your point, we at these conferences, we sit down with so many of these physicians and these clinicians that are, in the office with these patients, and they all have that same concern, okay, well, is machine learning going to take the place of, my human physician? I want that patient-physician interaction. And over again, we keep hearing the same thing. No, it's not. But to Leila's point, it's going to help with them, having these menial tasks taken care of so that they can actually focus more on making the diagnoses that need to be made and, figuring out patient care and focusing on cures and focusing on patient recovery. So we keep hearing the same thing over and over again of, AI is here to stay, whether you like it or not. And kind of what you referenced earlier, Stephen, like those physicians that don't get on board with it are going to kind of be left in the past, because this is now just a new tool to utilize, in the office, not necessarily something that's going to replace the physician. So I feel like once the general public kind of understands that and digests that, they'll be a little bit more on board with utilizing AI and utilizing machine learning in their overall patient care.
But Jesse actually had a couple of really interesting things to say. One of the things he was talking about was patient records, right? It was all the data that kind of underpins this, and important to getting that right.
Electronic health records are difficult because of privacy concerns. Whereas, data on the internet, which is publicly available, you can train models on it. There's not too much of a privacy issue with that. Whereas electronic health records, it's completely different. And also in terms of the records that you have and recording that information, you have things like socioeconomic factors which are attached to people, and that impacts the type of model you train and the results you get from it. And I think a huge part of that is going to be synthetic data. So data which is generated from inferences and then using that synthetic data to feed back into a model to train it. And the beauty of kind of synthetic data, which we don't really talk about much, is that it protects people's privacy, but you can still use it to power models because it replicates the statistical probabilities that you see in real life data. So I think that's potentially where we might see medical data go.
Leila, you bring up an interesting point. A lot of the big advocates for AI and machine learning, say that this will really help with, making sure that every demographic is represented when it comes to this data. And so, for example, certain communities that maybe have been underserved when it comes to health records or to, clinical trials or clinical studies, that this will kind of correct that problem. But there is actually an article in The Lancet today where the NHS is actually being urged not to prioritize AI and machine learning over some of the more traditional, cures and different types of cancer treatments. And one of the things that I found interesting that it points out is that there has kind of been this long-held belief about these new technologies will reverse inequalities. But the author of the paper actually says that the reality is that some of these tools can actually create additional barriers for those with poor digital or health literacy. So that kind of brings into the conversation of, well, what about some of these underserved communities or these underrepresented groups that maybe don't have the access to the internet, technology, and so it kind of opens up the door to how are we going to, deal with that problem? How are we going to address that concern? And he just really said, that we really caution against these technocentric approaches without more of a robust evaluation from an equity perspective. So, that paper's author is really kind of saying, look, we do need to focus more on making sure that when we are aggregating this data, that we are actually pulling from every single, community and every single demographic.
Yeah, and I think it's concerning because AI is nothing without data, and data, that's what makes it so difficult. And I think what surprised everyone in the technology world, the data science world, was that these new models like ChatGPT, which are completely revolutionary and can do very complicated things, the way that they got there was by just giving it more data.
Right.
It's quite risky that the only way to get it better is by giving it more data. And if the people in underserved communities aren't producing that data, that's particularly worrying. And also, we don't actually know how this thing is functioning a lot of the time. That's the biggest concern. It's a bit of a black box.
Well, there are companies, we should point out, that are working at a feverish pace to try to address this issue. And one of those is Recursion. And recently at the Society of Toxicology meeting in Salt Lake City, our host, Tanya Papanikolas, sat down with Recursion CEO Chris Gibson to talk about the TechBio revolution. And I mentioned this at the top of today's episode. For years, we've been focused on the biotech industry and, how these biopharmaceutical companies are using a little bit of technology to help in their, creation of these, drugs and treatments. Well, now we've got companies that are coming and kind of flipping that notion on its head. They are more technology companies that are really focusing on the computer aspect of, biology and biopharma to try and help these clinicians and help these physicians when it comes to utilizing AI in their practice. So take a listen to his interview with Tanya Papanikolas.
We want to welcome to the studio right now Chris Gibson, who is co-founder and CEO of Recursion. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Now, you guys deal with drug discovery, and
That's
I know
right.
you've been a proponent of the shift from traditional biotech to TechBio. What's the difference? They sound similar.
They do. Well, biotech was already a term that was taken, which was disappointing. But that was a field that really came into being in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, using large molecules to usher in a new era of drug discovery, development, and impact for patients. TechBio is a new era of digitally native companies that are using tools like machine learning and AI as a fundamental piece of how they're trying to advance medicines to patients.
Okay, so what's your favorite part of being a part of this field?
Well, I just love working at the interface of all these different areas. We've got biologists and chemists, software engineers and data scientists, computational biologists, all coming together to try and advance medicines to patients more quickly, and learning from all of those different fields, the cultures of all of those different fields, and bringing them together into kind of a new generation, I think is just super exciting.
What is TechBio's significance, do you think, for the field of drug discovery?
Well, as you know, about 90% of drugs that make it into the clinic ultimately fail before they make it to market. And that's despite hundreds of thousands of incredible scientists around the world trying their very hardest to advance these medicines. And it's not because they're not very talented, it's because biology is so extraordinarily complex. When you've got 20,000 genes encoding hundreds of thousands of proteins inside of each of trillions of cells inside of us, it's no wonder that it's pretty challenging to find a medicine that works, or you find a medicine that works and then it has some sort of unexpected toxicity. And so what I think is exciting about TechBio is that machine learning and AI tools are really good at sifting through really large data sets and identifying patterns in those data where humans maybe aren't as good at that kind of work, at that kind of scale. And so our hope is that these tools in our hands and other people's hands over the coming decades are going to fundamentally shift the probability of success of discovering and developing a medicine. And ultimately, that means we can have better medicines for patients. And I think over time, we can drive down the cost of medicines too.
Are there any specific challenges you face in dealing with TechBio?
There's more challenges than I could possibly list.
Sure.
Maybe I'll talk about a few of the most top of mind ones. One is we are building a new field, and it requires a new culture, as we talked about before. And so teaching a biologist the language of a data scientist or a software engineer the language of the chemists requires an incredible investment. And there's more and more education where we're seeing people come out of grad school or a postdoc with this training already in hand. But at least in our early days, finding those people was pretty rare. And so we had to train a lot of them in-house. And it's this cultural shift that I think is really the only thing holding the field back right now.
And then on the flip side of the coin, what opportunities do you see being a part of this field?
I just see the opportunity for industrializing drug discovery, for removing all the toil that all of these scientists have to go through. I mean, we had this thing early on where people were cut and pasting things in Excel spreadsheets in the early days of the company. And once in a while, somebody would miss just one line. And something like that can fundamentally set a program back. And these are super easy things to do. There are tools today that can eliminate all of that toil, that can automate so many of those pieces of discovering and developing medicines. And what's more, these tools can also do really complex things, like look at massive data sets spanning hundreds of thousands or millions of patients or millions of experiments to help us identify what we hope will be the very best drug for each patient.
How do you feel like technologies like AI and machine learning are helping the field of drug discovery?
They're accelerating and helping us look more broadly. So a great example of this is in a traditional high throughput screen, you might test 1 million or 2 million molecules physically. Today, we've trained machine learning models that have looked at 36 billion molecules to help us identify the ones that are best to actually go do the physical screen on. And so we sort of think of AI and ML as tools that open the aperture more broadly for us to explore biology and chemistry more broadly, and then help us narrow down more quickly, essentially fail a lot and fail fast, but do it early in the process when it's less expensive and when you haven't invested too many resources.
So obviously bringing new drugs to market can be very costly, take a lot of time. How do these new technologies kind of help that process along?
Well, so they help the per program cost really fundamentally. They help us look at more data with way fewer people and drive these programs much more quickly. So we're about half the time and half the cost to take a program from initiation to clinical trials, at least, at Recursion compared to the industry average. That said, in order to train these models to make them better and better, you have to generate massive data sets or access massive data sets. And there's a tremendous amount of cost there. And so while we're spending less on each program, we're investing really deeply in the machine, the operating system, for us to discover these medicines.
So how does big data and analytics support the modern drug discovery process?
I think it does that by, again, helping us just open the aperture, look more broadly at biology and chemistry. I think it does that by helping us find patterns in those data that you or I couldn't see. I mean, we've got billions of images of human cells from our microscopes, and I can look at some of those images, even having been trained in the space, and they look about the same to me. Whereas our machine learning and computer vision algorithms can recognize out of hundreds of thousands of unique perturbations, RNAi, CRISPR-Cas9 reagents, proteins, small molecules, exactly what molecule was added to each one of those cellular contexts almost perfectly. And so there's something fundamentally better about these tools in certain questions that you ask and answer in our field.
When it comes to the amount of data that is produced, I can imagine there would be a ton of it. Yeah. How do you deal with that, and how do you manage and interpret it?
So today we have access to or have generated 50 petabytes of data. To put that in perspective, if you took every feature-length film in human history, so every movie ever made in every language, it would be about 4 petabytes. So this is like 10 times all the movies ever in 1080p high definition. So it's a huge amount of data. What it means is about 40% of our team are software engineers and data scientists, because we have to be handling data on the same scale as a company like Twitter. So we're as much a tech company as we are a biotech company. And if you do that wrong, you can rack up a $10 million bill just in your storage costs in 1 month if you mess it up.
Oh my gosh, that's a challenge.
Yeah, absolutely.
So how do you think the field of AI and machine learning, how do you think that's going to continue moving forward with drug discovery?
Well, I think like any new tool, you feel like it's supposed to be delivering overnight. And the reality is in the next couple of years, maybe we'll feel like it's under-delivering. Maybe some of the early tests will fail. But over a decade, when you have these kind of exponential improvements, I think we're going to be blown away by how much the field changes. I think it was Archimedes who said, give me a lever long enough and I can move the earth. And it feels to me like for this generation, AI is that lever, and everything in our lives is going to change in a huge way over the next 10 to 15 years.
And that makes me think of how much things do change from 5 years to 10 years to 15
Think back, I mean, I remember calling my parents on a payphone from the movie theater, and who thinks about that now, right? The world's changing fast.
What kind of challenge does that present to you as machine learning changes so quickly as well?
Well, what it means is that we have to have a team that's constantly learning. And I think that's the lesson for everybody in this space, is that you've got to be open-minded, you've got to be adaptable, and if you learn to leverage these tools, I think you can have extraordinary success in the field. But if you push back against these tools, it's fine to be critical and explore, but if you fundamentally are closed-minded to these kinds of tools, I think you'll find yourself left behind.
All right, there's our warning right there.
There it is.
So do you think there are other emerging technologies that also could be impacting the field?
Absolutely. I mean, from the really long-term, maybe things like quantum computing, and even just looking at the quality of some of the biological tools. So when we started Recursion 10 years ago, CRISPR-Cas9 was not a thing. We were using RNAi. And just to see how far we've come with a tool like CRISPR, knowing there's things like prime editing, base editing, et cetera, coming down the line, I'm really excited about the future.
Are there any ethical considerations that you have to take into account when applying AI to drug discoveries?
This is a really important question, and especially if we're going to develop medicines that we put into people. We got a question earlier today at the plenary about whether or not we would just take a prediction from AI and go into the clinic, and the answer is absolutely not. We're still going to go run all of the experiments that one has to run to go through the traditional FDA or EMA processes. But what we're going to be able to do is pick which molecule or molecules are best and most likely to advance through all of those different tests so that we can go faster and have early failure, not late failure. But we're still going to do all the assays, at least for the next decade or two, I think.
Okay, that's great. So how do you think the industry should deal with some of these challenges?
Well, I think that we're seeing large companies adopt these tools, small companies build these tools. What was interesting in our field is that I think the wake-up moment for me, well, I've been doing this for a decade, but the wake-up moment for many people like us was AlphaFold and the prediction of protein folding that happened about 3 years ago using machine learning and AI. This was a space that people didn't think was going to be solved for decades, and almost overnight, over about 3 years, it was fundamentally solved with these tools. But for some reason, that didn't really wake the field up. What seems to have gotten everybody's attention about this is ChatGPT. There's something about just human language, our interactions, that makes language a powerful influencer of us. And seeing the power of a tool like ChatGPT, I think really woke a lot of people in the industry up to what could happen. Large language models themselves, I don't think are going to be the primary driver of the industry, at least not in the way that ChatGPT's been built. But I do think that these kinds of tools are now top of mind for everybody. Large companies, medium companies, small companies.
How do you think you balance those fears that people have of machine learning with the benefits?
Well, I think like everything in life, if you approach it with an open mindset, you have the best probability of having a good outcome.
And what advice would you give to young professionals who may be interested in this field or interested in contributing more to this field?
I'd say two things. One, it's no longer maybe the best idea to devote your entire career to learning how to code. That now is going to be done almost entirely through natural language. So, I would tell my kids probably not to learn to code. Spend your time just learning how to think about problems, what questions to ask, and how to answer them. And then there will be so many new tools. It's like, you still had to know a little bit of math when we got the calculator, but it wasn't as important to memorize all of the same stuff. So that's one. The other piece of advice I'd give is surround yourself with incredible mentors. And that's something I was fortunate to have, incredible mentors around me that helped me learn and then helped build the company that we've been building over the last decade. And if you don't do that, I think it's really hard to have the success that you'd hope for otherwise.
Yes, and I love your point about thinking, because even as machine technology gets more and more advanced, thinking never goes out of style.
That's right. It's always helpful.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank
we
you.
appreciate it.
Glad to be here.
So that was such an interesting interview, right? And a couple of bites of that I found really interesting and really unexpected. You know, I love the bit where he said that Archimedes said, "Give me the biggest lever you can and I will move the world." And now he's saying that AI is that lever, right? So over the next 10 or 15 years, we are going to move the world. So exciting times. And the other thing that, you were saying, Autria, at TechBio, he's kind of saying that, almost half of his employees are data scientists, can rack up millions of dollars worth of bills just for storing the data that we're talking about. You know what? It's a new world.
Truly. I mean, he's saying that if they didn't have all of those software engineers and data scientists on their payroll working for them, that they could be paying $10 million a month in storage of all of this data. So it's really, he makes a very strong economic argument for why they've got so many data scientists on their payroll.
Who knew there were so many, right?
Right, no kidding. And something else that's interesting when you're talking about big numbers is NVIDIA partnered with Recursion, and they made a $50 million investment into Recursion. I think just highlighting how big of an industry leader they see this, not just specifically Recursion, but this type of technology. I think it's evident that you've got these companies investing this much money in these tech companies, essentially, to make sure that when AI is completely rolled out and is being utilized in almost every single doctor's office in the world, that they were an active part of it.
And Layla, we found, haven't we, that this goes everywhere. This AI and biotech, and TechBio, and it's sort of the world of statistics, almost everywhere. And even actually finding the energy itself to power AI is quite a challenge, right?
It's astounding, I think, that the demand for energy for AI has been the thing that has actually pushed investment into renewables, as opposed to the fact that it would be good for the planet and climate change. But that's what's caused a massive surge in our investment in renewable energy, because we just do not have enough to power the training of AI models.
So just to kind of put that into perspective as far as how much energy we're actually already using to run AI tasks, the World Economic Forum did the math, they broke down the numbers, and the energy required to run AI tasks is already accelerating at an annual growth rate between 26 and 36%. Okay, so what does that mean? In the next 5 years, AI could be using more power than the entire country of Iceland used in 2021. So yeah, they definitely need to figure out a way to, make this as clean as possible, because that's only going to explode as AI becomes more and more ubiquitous.
Autria, that's such a great point, and I'm glad you brought it up, because that's the next episode of Agents of Tech. We're exploring just that. I can hardly wait.
Absolutely, and with that, it's time for us to say goodbye. We want to say thanks to Layla Rizzi for joining us.
Thank you, Layla.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Autria.
Absolutely. Hope you'll come back with us once again, and make sure that you like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts from. And with that, we say goodbye.
Goodbye.
Agents of Tech is brought to you by Web's Edge.